They say scars tell stories, but almost no one wants to hear them, especially when they're not found in award-winning books or inspiring movies, but rather etched on the face of someone who serves your coffee every day without ever being noticed. She was just another waitress, black, silent, and marked. Her scars stretched from her chin to her temple, as if pain had left a permanent signature on her face. And while she delivered orders with a restrained smile, the sidelong glances, hushed whispers, and disguised expressions were as much a part of the scene as the decor itself. She had grown accustomed to being the target of curiosity masked as indifference, pity masked as judgment, compassion that never materialized. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared her for what was about to happen. That morning, the upscale restaurant in the affluent district buzzed with the usual noise of casual meetings, brunches among businessmen, and socialite gatherings chasing yet another candid photo for social media. The waitstaff moved with almost choreographed precision. Glasses gleamed, laughter echoed, plates were served with perfection, and in the midst of this meticulously polished scene was her, Melina, with her tray in her arms and her eyes fixed on the floor, as if each step required not just balance but resilience. Customers preferred not to look at her for too long, perhaps out of discomfort, perhaps out of fear of confronting a pain they couldn't name. And every time she passed a table she could hear whispers. Did you see her face? Was it a street fight? Looks like gang stuff. Poor thing, but no one asked. They just assumed. No one listened. They just labeled. Dolores Albuquerque arrived accompanied by a young, discreet caregiver. She wore a beige cashmere coat, imported leather shoes, and a pearl necklace that seemed to have belonged to royalty. She was the kind of woman who carried authority without needing to raise it. Her presence was enough. The widow of a naval industry magnate, heiress to a discreet but solid empire, and known for never visiting the same restaurant more than twice in a month. But that morning, for a reason even she couldn't explain, she returned to the place she'd been to 2 weeks earlier. She ordered jasmine tea in silence, but fate, as always, had other plans, and the turning point of this story was just a few steps away. Melina approached the table as she did with all the others. Head down, soft steps, impeccable posture. She placed the cup on the table without spilling a drop. But the exact moment she raised her eyes and met Dolores's, something inexplicable happened. The older woman dropped her cutlery. Her fingers trembled, her eyes fixed on that scarred face as if seeing a ghost. The silence that followed was heavy. The caregiver tried to intervene, but Dolores raised her hand, asking her to say nothing. Her eyes filled with tears, but not out of pity. There was recognition, shock, perhaps regret. "Where did you get those scars?" she asked. Her voice wasn't accusatory, but carried the weight of lament. The dining room froze, as if a song had been abruptly cut off. The waitress stood still, not because it was the first time someone had asked her that, but because this time there seemed to be an equivalent pain behind the question. She didn't answer. She merely nodded slightly, forcing a polite smile, and turned to leave. But Dolores wouldn't let it die in silence. She called the manager with authority. She said she wanted to speak with the employee, that she wanted her seated at her table, that it was personal. The manager hesitated, but Dolores was clear. Either she sits, or I buy this restaurant right now and restructure the entire staff. Everyone knew she could. And so, with collective discomfort hanging in the air, Melina found herself seated across from the most powerful woman she had ever served. "My name is Melina," she said in a barely audible voice, "and these scars don't define me, but they've been with me since I was 7. That's how it began. The words came slowly, like pulling out old thorns. I was burned alive by my own parents, who were under the influence of drugs. I spent days trapped in a room while the house caught fire. I survived by a miracle, but I was never the same. I was taken to shelters, rejected by families. 3 adoption attempts. All failed. I started working early. I never studied properly, but I always loved books. I read the ones customers left behind, jotted down words, copied phrases, and each sentence came with a pause, not out of insecurity, but out of respect for her own pain. Dolores listened with trembling hands. At one point she removed her dark glasses, revealing wet, red eyes. "I had a daughter," she said. "She too had a scarred face. She died in a house fire. I couldn't save her. And I've never been able to look at anyone with even a single burn without reliving it." Silence. Absolute silence. the kind of silence only truth can impose. Melina didn't know what to say. Dolores simply reached out and touched her hand, not with superiority but with reverence. They stayed there for nearly 2 hours. Dolores cancelled appointments, turned off her phone, and asked the manager to serve desserts, but only for them. When she finally stood, she did something no one expected. She asked to speak to all the staff. Standing beside Melina, she declared, "As of today, this young woman is my personal assistant. I will train her, teach her everything I know about leadership, business, and legacy. But more than that, I will listen to her. Because scars like these are not a source of shame, they are emblems." The restaurant applauded, and for a week, the local papers talked of nothing else. What no one knew at that moment was that Dolores wasn't just offering a job. She was allowing herself to relive a part of her own story that she had buried under layers of silence and luxury. For the first time in years, she felt she could turn pain into legacy. And Melina, in turn, wasn't just receiving an opportunity. She was being rescued from a cycle of invisibility that seemed eternal. Her first day as an assistant was strange. She didn't know how to act. She'd never had a badge with her name, never sat in an air-conditioned room to brainstorm ideas. She was used to following orders, not being heard. And as liberating as that was, it was also terrifying. Dolores, however, was patient. She ordered new clothes, set up a small office in her home, and gave her new protégé a mission: to listen to the stories of women like her, marked, rejected, but not destroyed. For weeks, Melina worked in silence, as she always had. But now there was a difference. Each task came with a look of trust. Dolores gave her old texts, business documents, and letters from her late daughter. The two began reading together every day at 6 in the morning on a balcony lit by the rising sun. It was almost a ritual, and little by little Melina began to blossom. She discovered a talent for writing, a knack for strategic organization, and above all, an empathy for handling situations even Dolores couldn't face. One morning, while reading a letter left by Dolores' daughter before her death, Melina had an idea. "Why don't we start a foundation?" she asked timidly. "An organization to help women with visible and invisible scars, a place where they are seen, heard, and healed." Dolores looked at her in silence for a few seconds and said simply, "We start tomorrow." The foundation was named after Dolores' daughter, Clara Albuquerque. Its first headquarters was set up in an old family mansion, carefully renovated to preserve its structure, but equipped with modern technology. Melina became the general coordinator. She gave interviews, spoke at events, and over time became a public voice for something that was once just silence. The foundation offered psychotherapy sessions, aesthetic rehabilitation, professional training, and above all, active listening. There, no one asked, "What happened to you?" as invasive curiosity, but rather, "What do you want to share about your journey?" And that simple shift in approach worked miracles. Women who once lived hidden began wearing dresses, smiles, and their own names again. Many returned to school, others started businesses, but all, without exception, felt part of something greater. The press began following the foundation's journey. Melina was invited to speak at universities, TV shows, and even corporate events. Her image, once tied to her scars, became a symbol of resilience and leadership, but with visibility came attacks. On social media, some said she only got where she was out of pity. Others claimed Dolores was just trying to replace her dead daughter. There were videos distorting her words, cruel memes, and even anonymous threats. For a few days, Melina considered giving up. She cried alone in the bathroom, as she had in her waitressing days, but Dolores, noticing, sat beside her and said, "If they're attacking, it's because your light is disturbing shadows that were too comfortable." And that day, Melina decided she would no longer retreat. If her story caused discomfort, it was because it revealed truths no one wanted to see. One evening, after wrapping up a charity event, Melina found an elderly woman waiting for her outside. The woman, about 80 years old, walked with difficulty and held a small wooden box. As she approached, she said, "I waited over 50 years to give this to someone who would make sense of it." It was an old bronze medal inscribed with, "For those who survived without forgetting who they are." The woman explained she had been one of the first nurses to care for burned children in the 1970s, when clear support protocols didn't exist. And since then, she had kept the medal, waiting to find someone who not only survived, but turned pain into a bridge. Melina, in tears, accepted the gift as if receiving a war inheritance, and when she returned home, she placed the medal beside Clara's letter, a symbol of all that was being restored. Time passed. 3 years since that day in the restaurant. The foundation now had 5 branches across the country. Thousands of women served. Partnerships with universities, hospitals, and even international organizations. Dolores, though physically frailer, followed everything with the same spark in her eyes as someone watching a seed sprout through concrete. She said Melina had reincarnated Clara's spirit, not as a replacement, but as a continuation, and that was more than enough for her soul to find peace. At a public ceremony, the city's mayor presented Melina with the symbolic key to the city, declaring she had transformed not just lives, but mindsets. And in her speech, Melina said something that would be remembered. "My scars don't shame me. They remind me I survived. But what defines me is what I build with them every day." One Sunday morning, Dolores passed away, sleeping, peacefully, in the bed prepared for her, overlooking the garden. Melina was the only one present. She held her hand and read a passage from Clara's favorite book when her breathing stopped. There were tears, yes, but there was also peace. Dolores left knowing she had not only found redemption, but left an eternal legacy. At the funeral, Melina spoke with a steady voice, eyes wet but heart whole. She said Dolores hadn't changed her life with money, but with listening, care, and the courage to love again. And that if the world had more Doloreses and fewer judgments, fewer muffled laughs and more sincere questions, perhaps no Melina would have to wait so long to bloom. After the burial, Melina returned to the restaurant where it all began. She sat at the same table, ordered jasmine tea, and stayed there in silence, not as a waitress, not as an assistant, but as a whole woman, who not only survived the flames, but learned to turn them into light. Some staff recognized her. Others, newer, didn't know who she was, and that didn't matter. Because in that moment, Melina understood her mission wasn't to be remembered as the woman with scars, but as the woman who listened, cared, and lifted others. And in that understanding, she smiled. A few months after Dolores's passing, Melina received a handwritten letter from an unknown address. The envelope was recycled paper, with no sender, but bore a single phrase on the front. "Memory is the flame that absence cannot extinguish." Inside, she found delicate, aged handwriting and contents that made her take a deep breath. It was a letter from Clara, dated 4 months before her death. It began with a simple request. "If one day my mother finds someone who carries the marks of life on their body, let her not run, because perhaps in that person I am trying to return." Melina Re-Readruff system, the letter as if holding a mirror that revealed not the past but purpose. And there, alone in that silent room, she understood what had truly happened that afternoon in the restaurant. It wasn't just a meeting. It was a reunion with something that transcended time and biology. Clara had gone, but her soul had found a way to continue. With time, Melina decided to expand the Foundation's mission, not only to serve women with visible traumas, but also those with hidden wounds, emotional scars, invisible marks that, though they didn't disfigure the face, dimmed the light in their eyes. She launched programs for survivors of domestic violence, victims of psychological abuse, people who had attempted suicide, and mothers who lost children in silent tragedies. And with each new project, Melina insisted on personally participating in the listening. She never outsourced what she considered sacred, the moment someone finally felt worthy of being heard. And curiously, it was in that space of listening that she healed the most. With every story she embraced, another layer of fear peeled away from her chest. She was no longer driven by survival, but by purpose, and that changed everything. Years later, at an international conference on human resilience in Geneva, Melina was invited as the keynote speaker. She took the stage wearing an elegant navy blue suit, her hair neatly tied back, but with no makeup covering her scars. She made a point of leaving them visible. When she took the microphone, the auditorium was filled with diplomats, activists, doctors, and journalists. But she didn't start with data or catchy phrases. She began with silence, a silence heavy with presence. Then she said, "Scars don't need to be hidden for us to be accepted. They are part of our soul's landscape. And as long as the world tries to erase them with filters, surgeries, or denial, it will keep slowly killing those who have the most to teach." Applauded on her feet for minutes, she left the stage with tears in her eyes. not from public emotion, but from the full awareness of what she had become, a mirror unafraid of its reflection. Back in Brazil, Melina founded the Renascença Institute, a school to train young leaders from shelters, peripheries, and vulnerable contexts. The first class had 80 students. Among them was a 14-year-old girl named Sarah, who had survived a fire set by her own uncle. When Melina saw her for the first time, she almost stepped back, not because of the girl's appearance, but because it was like looking at herself at 7 years old, the same expression torn between fear and bravery, the same silent question in her eyes. Will you see me, or will you ignore me? And it was there that Melina realized her mission was only beginning, because as long as there was a girl waiting to be called by her name and not her trauma, the world would still need women like her. On the Foundation's 5th anniversary, a statue was erected in the city's central square, not in homage to Melina, but to all women with scars. The sculpture depicted the bust of a black woman with visible marks on her face and a silk scarf around her neck. Around the base was engraved the phrase Melina had said at Dolores's funeral: "If the world had more listening and less judgment, no pain would need to stay silent." The square became a place of pilgrimage. Schools brought their students, tourists took photos. But what struck most wasn't the statue itself, but the respectful silence it inspired, as if the sculpture spoke more than words ever could. At one point, a journalist wrote a book about Melina's journey. Titled "The Marks That Light Cannot Erase," it became a bestseller in months. Beyond her biography, it included stories of hundreds of women directly or indirectly impacted by her. Stories of new beginnings, reconciliations, reconstructions. But one of the most striking pages featured a photograph, a black and white image of Melina and Dolores sitting side by side on the balcony, laughing while drinking tea. The caption read, "Two women, two pains, one redemption." And it was true. Dolores had rescued Melina, but Melina, without realizing it, had rescued Dolores from an endless grief. Both had healed where the world said healing was impossible. In her later years, Melina remained active. She founded new institute branches, received international awards, declined invitations to enter politics, and wrote 3 books. But she never stopped returning, at least once a year, to the restaurant where it all began. Always on the same day, always at the same table. And she ordered the same jasmine tea. Sometimes customers recognized her, other times they didn't. But that no longer mattered. For her, that moment was more than a memory. It was gratitude, a silent celebration of life's improbability, a life that insisted on continuing, even when everything around it said it wasn't worth it. The last time she was there, a new waiter approached. Timid, unaware of who she was, he said, "They told me this is your favorite table. Can I ask why?" She smiled, looked around, then pointed to her chest and said, "Because it was here that my soul stopped asking for permission and started existing fully." The young man smiled, not quite understanding, and took her order. She laughed softly, like someone who knows certain answers only make sense with time. And then she sat there watching life go on, the restaurant bustling, plates being served, and stories unfolding. Silent, invisible, but no less real, just as hers once was. And so the waitress, once ridiculed for her scars, became a symbol of resilience, the founder of a silent revolution, a mentor to hundreds, and the heir to a legacy that could never be bought with money. Not by chance, not by luck, but because one day someone decided to ask not, "What happened to you?" but, "What do you carry that the world hasn't yet seen?" And that question, asked at the right moment, changed not just one life. It changed Fasi 1E9, changed the course of many. And it will keep changing, as long as there is someone willing to listen, and someone brave enough to tell.